Hello everybody, today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going through Learning Plan 10, which covers the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is a really important system in the body, but the most important thing that we talk about when it comes to endocrine system is the way that the endocrine system works, the physiology of the endocrine system. And here in General A&P, we really don't talk about the physiology of anything much. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover the anatomy of the endocrine system with a little bit of a background on how the endocrine system works, just a little bit. But this learning plan is fairly unobtrusive when it comes to covering the anatomy, because we're just looking at the different endocrine structures of the body, looking at hormones just a little bit, and that's about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive in here and we're going to look at the endocrine system itself. Just excuse me as I go back in here. I forgot to bring up the PowerPoints, so I got to jump into here and find that. Okay, where are we? Now these PowerPoints come from the older edition of the book, so if the picture should be the same, the figure numbers might differ a little bit, so just look in your book for the picture that corresponds with that, and you shouldn't have a problem. So when we talk about the endocrine system and what the endocrine system does, the endocrine system is hugely important because it helps regulate the body's processes. So pretty much any sort of homeostatic mechanism in our body is really regulated through the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is so important. And remember, we have two different types of glands in our body. We have the exocrine glands and we have the endocrine glands. The exocrine glands are the glands that secrete something into a duct or a tube, and then that tube will take whatever that secretion is and dump it off at a target site. So for example, your pancreas is 70% exocrine. So it's going to produce these digestive enzymes, and then they're carried and dropped off at a certain place in your small intestine. So anything that passes through that area is affected by whatever that secretion is. However, the endocrine system is different. The endocrine system is released into its environment by the gland. So the gland is just going to release it, and then it will be released in the periphery, and then wherever the blood takes that hormone, the hormone is going to go. And then the hormone is going to act on a cell that is responsive to that hormone. It has to fit lock and key with that hormone. And then when fitting lock and key with that hormone, it enables a change within the cell. Maybe it's going to tell the cell to engage in protein synthesis to make something. Maybe it's going to turn on a certain activity within the cell. Maybe it's going to turn something off. Maybe it's going to open up a channel. Maybe it's going to close a channel. All these are things that the hormones can do through their mechanism of action. We have different types of hormones. We have what are called autocrines, so they act on the same cell that secretes the hormone, or we have paracrines that are local chemical messengers that act on neighboring cells rather than the cells releasing them. So sometimes the hormones are going to have an effect on the cell itself. Sometimes it's going to send it out and have an effect on a cell somewhere else in the body. So that's the way the hormones work. But if you look at what hormones are, they're basically chemical signals. They're signals that tell the cell to do something. And they will tell the cell to perform a certain action. But they have to have a receptor that binds to it. So hormones only work on cells that are sensitive to the hormone. Only to the cells that are sensitive. So for example, if you have let me look at an example. Let's say one of your body's cells, one of your generic body cells. Let's say it's a muscle cell. Okay, your muscle cells have receptors for insulin on them, and then when insulin binds to the receptor, it's going to open up a channel in that cell that allows glucose to pass into the cell, so that the cell can convert that glucose into ATP. Not all cells have receptors for insulin, but the ones that have receptors for insulin, it's going to allow insulin to have an effect on that cell. And that's what we call a target cell. The bottom of page 1 in your notes, you can see the things that hormones typically do within the cell. And I mentioned some of them, but there's some other ones mentioned there. So the next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you on a tour, really, of the different endocrine organs or endocrine structures of the body, talk to you a little bit about what they do, what they secrete, how they work, and we're going to start with the most important one of them all, which is called the master gland, which is the pituitary gland. So let me jump over here into the notes on the pituitary gland. Let me PowerPoint up and we'll get going here. Okay, so this is the pituitary gland. And if you look at the pituitary gland, it has two lobes to it. One is the posterior pituitary, which we're going to start with first. And then the other one is the anterior pituitary. Now, you can see that these two lobes are separated. You can see that the posterior pituitary is definitely different than the anterior pituitary. That's because they have different origins. So the origin of the posterior pituitary is neurologic in nature. It's a direct extension of the nervous system. It hangs right off of the hypothalamus. So it's kind of like an outgrowth of the hypothalamus. So what we're going to see here in the posterior pituitary is that the posterior pituitary, which is also called the neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary is not going to produce its own hormones. What the posterior pituitary does is it simply stores hormones that are created by the hypothalamus. And there are only two hormones that the hypothalamus produces that are stored in the posterior pituitary. And there are two nuclei that are going to create those hormones. So we have the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. That's not important. What is important are the two secretions of the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and ADH. Oxytocin is a bonding hormone in both genders. When I say bonding, I mean like romantic bonding, feelings of love and affection. So when, for example, a baby is born and a father comes into contact with that newborn baby, he forms a bond with that baby. He forms a connection, an emotional bond with the baby. And that's regulated with oxytocin. We also have antidiuretic hormone, which is also called vasopressin. Antidiuretic hormone is an antidiuretic. It tells your body to conserve water. So when these two hormones are secreted, what's going to happen is they are going to be transported down this little tract called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract to the posterior pituitary, and they're going to be stored here. When your body needs it, they release the hormones into the vasculature, into the blood when needed. And then whatever components, or other, I should say cells of your body are receptive to oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, they're going to be affected by it. Antidiuretic hormone targets the kidneys for the most part, but other structures too. Now we have the anterior pituitary gland, which is called the adenohypophysis. The adenohypophysis is glandular in origin. So the anterior pituitary is going to be able to secrete, to make its own hormones. So it's a little bit different than what we saw in the posterior pituitary, in that the hypothalamus and the neurons in the hypothalamus are going to release either a releasing or inhibiting hormone. This is a command signal that gets dumped into this capillary plexus called the primary capillary plexus, carries those hormones down here, and then it tells the anterior pituitary to produce something in response to it. So it's going to say, for example, we need growth hormone. So from the hypothalamus, we will create a growth hormone releasing hormone. And then that will be sent down to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary says, oh, I need to produce some growth hormone. So then the anterior lobe of the pituitary will produce growth hormone. And then growth hormone will be released into the bloodstream, and then it will travel to all the different areas of the body, and whatever cells are receptive or sensitive to growth hormone are going to be affected by growth hormone, and then it's going to have its effect. So you can see that there are 6 hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary. Let me just clear this off so we can take a look at them. We have thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, growth hormone, and prolactin. So thyroid stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the ovaries or the testes to produce the reproductive cells. Luteinizing hormone is going to cause the release of the sex hormones to support the development of the reproductive cells. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is a stress hormone. Also, I should say, helps your body regulate stress and also affects fluid balance. Growth hormone, self-explanatory. It's going to target the areas of your body that grow larger, or the maintenance of body structures and so forth. Prolactin, more notable in women than men as far as its mechanism of action, in that it allows for the production of milk by the mammary glands. Just disregard this term. Actually, let me get out of here. I'm gonna take out these attendance terms because we're not using them this time around. So there are no attendance terms. So please do not worry about these attendance terms. I'm not going to be using them. Oh, there we go. Okay. No attendance terms. In your book, you have a table. I'm not sure if it's table 16.1. It might be a little bit different in your edition of the book. But you do have this table. It's a really nice table because what it's going to do is it's going to give you the name of the pituitary hormone. You give the name of the pituitary hormone, and it's going to tell you what regulates the release. Growth hormone, releasing hormone, in this case, what it targets, and then what happens if you have hypo, which means under secretion, or hyper, which means over secretion of that particular hormone. So look at growth hormone. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but basically what you see in the bottom here, these 4 boxes, this is what you end up seeing happen as a result of the secretion of growth hormone. We have some other anterior pituitary hormones here. So if you have to, for an assignment, come up with what these hormones do, you've got the information right here for you in this wonderful table. All right, moving on to the thyroid gland. You can see that the thyroid gland is located on, it actually has 2 lobes located on either side of the trachea or the windpipe. In a normal thyroid gland, you cannot feel the thyroid gland. If it is enlarged, then you might be able to palpate it or feel it from the outside. If you look at the thyroid gland, you have these follicles which are filled with kind of like a fluid. It's called a colloid. And we have 2 main thyroid hormones, T4 and T3, and what they do is they affect our metabolic rate and body heat production. So when we have an increase in thyroid hormone production, our body temperature will increase because our metabolic rate increases. A person who has an overactive thyroid is going to feel like they're warm all the time. They have an increased body temperature. They feel like they're eating all the time. They're very nervous, shaky. Their body is on edge. And some people said, oh, this sounds great. This sounds wonderful. I'd love to have that because I wouldn't have to worry about weight issues, but it's really not a desirable condition to have. On the other side, if you have an underactive thyroid, you're relatively cold all the time. Your hair and nails are thick. You feel sluggish, lethargic. That's not good either. The other role of the thyroid gland is that it releases a hormone called calcitonin, which helps regulate our blood calcium levels and actually helps decrease blood calcium levels. So what it's going to do is it's going to take the calcium out of the blood and put it into the bone. So calcitonin is going to help regulate the blood calcium levels. You can see here in this table the major effects of the thyroid hormone on the body. So you can see how it affects the metabolic rate, your metabolism, your nervous system, your cardiovascular system, so on and so forth. Going on to the different systems of the body if you need to know that information. Looking at the parathyroid glands, if you flip the body over and you look at it from the posterior aspect, this is the pharynx. So this is like the throat, the back of the throat, involved in swallowing. Here's the esophagus, where the food goes down. You can see the trachea is anterior to that. There's 4 little spots here. 1, 2, 3, 4 spots. These are the parathyroid glands. They release a hormone called, believe it or not, parathyroid hormone. It's very unusual for us anatomists to actually use an intuitive term, but here they did. They say the parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone has the opposite effect on blood calcium levels as calcitonin. So calcitonin decreased blood calcium levels, meaning it deposited the calcium in the bone. Now parathyroid is going to rob the bone from the calcium and put it into the blood. It's also going to increase the absorption of calcium in the kidneys and activate vitamin D, which helps us absorb more calcium from our food. So here's the effect of the parathyroid hormone on the bone, the kidneys, and intestines. So you can see we release the parathyroid hormone. What we're doing is we're taking the calcium reabsorption in the kidneys. We also promote the activation of vitamin D, which increases calcium absorption. And we're also going to pull the calcium out of the bone in order to increase blood calcium levels. Moving on to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands, they're not very flashy. They don't look great. They don't even look significant. If you open up a cadaver and look at the adrenal glands, it's just like a big hunk of fat sitting on top of the kidneys, but they're very important. You see the adrenal gland here. And you can see that adrenal gland has an outer shell and an inner core. The outer shell is called the cortex, and the inner shell is called the medulla. And you can see that the cortex is made up of, or it's surrounded by a capsule. This is kind of like the skin of the adrenal gland. And then we have 3 areas: zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. And these 3 areas are going to release different kinds of hormones that are designed to have a certain effect on the body. So as you can see in your notes, page 3, Roman numeral number 6, letter B, the adrenal cortex produces corticosteroids from these 3 distinct regions. One is the zona glomerulosa, which we see here, the top layer, and that's going to produce mineralocorticoids, or mineralocorticoids. They produce it, but as they pronounce it here, but they are, okay, that's an inconsistency, because if you look at number 1 below that in B, it's mineralocorticoids. Okay, so the mineralocorticoids, as you go down to number 1, they regulate electrolyte concentration of extracellular fluids. So basically, it's going to affect our sodium levels and our potassium levels, which then is going to regulate your kidneys and how much fluid they retain versus don't retain. And so we have this mechanism called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, which we'll talk about in advanced A&P, but basically what I want you to get out of this is that the mineralocorticoids are going to regulate your body fluid levels, simply put. The next one, the zona fasciculata, is going to regulate the glucocorticoids. And if you go down to number 2 under letter B, the glucocorticoids help us, handle stress. So they're released in response to stress that help us mediate stress, deal with stress. And it also is the primary cause of gluconeogenesis, which is the storage of the glucose into I'm sorry, backwards. We're taking and making glucose out of non-glucose sources. That's what it means. Sorry. And also encouraging our body to use fats and amino acids as an energy source. So this is basically our long-term stress response. So if we're exposed to stress for a long period of time, we're basically burning out the adrenal glands, and the glucocorticoids are the ones that we start to lose. So when you look at the cortex and the secretions of the cortex of the medulla, you can essentially burn out this area of the adrenal gland. You can go through adrenal burnout. But then we also have the gonatocorticoids. These are weak androgens. They're converted into testosterone and estrogens in the tissue cells. And that was formed by the zona reticularis. So again, if you suffer from adrenal burnout, you're going to see that your sex hormones are affected as well. And to the point where the normal sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone, they start to have to, I should say their levels begin to get affected, because their body is essentially rating the sex hormones, because we have a depletion of the hormones that are created by the zona reticularis. Then we have the adrenal medulla, the innermost portion. This is responsible for secreting our short-term stress hormones, primarily epinephrine and norepinephrine. And this becomes active when we're in that fight or flight phase of the autonomic nervous system, fight or flight. So when we have the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, our heart rate is going to increase, our pupils are going to dilate, we're going to be ready to either fight for our lives or run away from the danger. So about 80% of the hormone is stored as epinephrine, 20% is norepinephrine. And it's really hard to burn out this area of the adrenal gland. So it's really hard to run out of epinephrine and norepinephrine, because it can be produced very quickly, and its effects are pretty long-lasting too, once they're secreted. So when we look at what stress does to the body and how we regulate stress, how we handle stress, oh, that's not this picture. We're talking about, in this one, aldosterone. Really just look at this. Just look at this bottom picture here, this bottom box here. What we see is that the end result of aldosterone secretion is blood volume increases. So we're basically increasing the amount of fluid in our body, which then affects blood pressure. As far as the glucocorticoids, we have excess production of the glucocorticoids. It's a condition called Cushing's syndrome. And one of the physical manifestations of Cushing's syndrome is what they call the buffalo hump on the back, and the accumulation of fat around the chin, the neck, the back of the neck, and so forth. The opposite of this is obviously an underabundance, underproduction of the glucocorticoids, and that's something called Addison's disease. So those are kind of like the yin and the yang of the glucocorticoid secretion. So again, in this table, nice table, gives you the adrenal gland hormones, summarizes their effects and how we regulate them. So if you need that, here's what I was hoping to show you before, which is the stress response. So when we're exposed to stress over the long term, the cortex of the adrenal gland is going to mediate stress through the mineralocorticoids and the glucocorticoids. And you can see what happens here. We retain sodium and water. Our blood pressure goes up when we're under stress, thanks to the mineralocorticoids. We also see that our metabolic functions are affected, and we have increased blood glucose, and finally suppression of the immune system. So this is why when people are under stress, their immune system isn't working so well. They get sick more often, they get sick more easily, they end up breaking out in the shingles because their immune system is busy doing other things, or it's suppressed altogether. One organ we didn't talk about here, or I don't have a picture for it, I got to come back up here to the beginning, is the pineal gland, which is next in the notes. And the pineal gland, you can see, is way up posterior to the hypothalamus, right in here. And the pineal gland, it secretes something called melatonin, and this regulates our day and night cycle. And it's believed that this gland receives input from our visual pathways, and it's connected to light. So the more light we experience, the more light we see, the more light we're exposed to, then the pineal gland is using that information to sort of regulate when we are alert and awake and when we are tired. So as the nights grow longer and the days grow shorter, in the winter months, pineal gland gets hit hard, and that's why we struggle with issues like seasonal affective disorder or the winter blues, because our day-night cycle is affected by our exposure to the light, and we just don't get enough of it in the wintertime. So the next thing we're going to go on to is the pancreas. Remember, the pancreas is 70% exocrine, but we're not focusing on that. We're focusing on the 30%, which is the endocrine part. So everything you see here in this blue periphery out here is actually, oops, I knew that was going to happen. As soon as I touched the screen, I knew it was going to do it. So we're not going to focus on the blue area here. This is exocrine. This is what is going to have an effect on our digestion. But I want you to focus on this pinkish area in here that I'm drawing a circle around. This is called the pancreatic islet, or the islet of Langerhans. And we have two different types of cells. We have alpha cells and beta cells. The alpha cells are going to produce glucagon. And glucagon is going to tell your body to break down the stored energy so that your body can use it for energy. And then the beta cells are the insulin producing cells, and insulin tells your body to take the glucose, for example, out of the blood and get it into the cells so that your body can convert that glucose into ATP. So the endocrine portion of the pancreas really is involved in regulating blood glucose levels. So if blood glucose levels go up, pancreas releases insulin, stimulates the tissue cells to take in the glucose, also telling the body to convert excess glucose into glycogen, which is a stored form of glucose. That will drop the blood glucose levels to a normal range. If our blood glucose level decreases, like between meals, for example, then the pancreas says, okay, I need to get out the glucagon, stimulates the liver to take this glycogen that was stored and now break it into glucose, raising blood glucose levels to normal range again. So glucagon and insulin are like opposites of each other, and they regulate our blood glucose levels. All right, so very briefly on page 4, letter B, the gonads and the placenta. The ovaries, which are the gonads of the female, they produce estrogen and progesterone, which helps regulate the body's sex characteristics, also helps regulate the uterine cycle. When the woman is pregnant, estrogen and progesterone are important in preserving the uterus so that it can be hospitable for an embryo. The testes are going to produce testosterone, which helps support the development of the sex cells. and the male sexual characteristics. If a woman is pregnant and she's got an embryo developing within her, or eventually a fetus, we have the development of the placenta. And then the placenta is going to secrete its own hormones, estrogen and progesterone, HCG, and that's going to help influence the uterus, helping the uterus continue to be hospitable to that embryo or that fetus so that the pregnancy can continue. The reason why I'm taking you to this table is because this is where we're going to end today, and it's a table of the hormones that are produced by organs other than the major endocrine organs. And you also see at letter C on the top of page 4, we have a section dedicated to the hormone secretion by the organs. So adipose tissue produces hormones. The gastrointestinal tract secretes its own hormones. The heart will secrete its own hormones. The kidneys, the skin, skeletal tissue, and the thymus all release their own hormones. And so this table, 16.5, is going to show you what hormones are produced by those organs other than the major endocrine organs, a little bit about their chemical composition, why they're released, and what they do. So if you need that information, I'm just putting it out there. It's readily available for you in your book. It doesn't do any good for me to read through it because you're all capable of reading and read through it as you need to in order to get through the information as you need to. So that, my friends, is that. We're all set. So that should take us through the end of Learning Plan 10. And on Blackboard, you have one assignment for Learning Plan 10. Take care of that. You're done. You don't have to do anything else. And we'll come back. For those of you who are taking advanced A&P, we'll come back to Learning Plan 10 at that time. And we'll talk more about the physiology of the endocrine system and how important the endocrine system is to all the functions of your body on a physiological level. Thanks so much for watching. Take care. We'll see you later. Goodbye.